Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. I am attempting to film this video in a place that's not going to be too cloudy or too dark or too bright or too whatever. And it's later in the day, so I'm also going to try to keep this as short as possible. I decided to do another tag video, and this is going to be the Unpopular Opinions Tag. It took me a while to figure out exactly what my answers would be to this tag, because I'm not sure what they really mean by unpopular opinions. Some of these opinions may be unpopular, some of them may not be. But we're going to see how it goes, and I'm going to do something a little bit different with this video because there are, I believe, 9 questions in this tag. I'm going to, of course, everybody who wants to do this tag and hasn't done it yet, feel free to go ahead and video your responses to the tag. Or if you don't want to do a video, you can leave comments in the comments section. Tell me what your responses to some of these questions would be. And because there are 9 questions, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this a little bit differently. I'll put a screen in between each one of my answers so that you can see the questions themselves, and that way I don't have to put everything in the description bar below. So it's going to be an edit fest, an edit marathon. Whoopee. A popular book or series you didn't like? The Princess Diaries. Sorry, but it's true. I didn't particularly care for it even when I was a teenager, because the books came out when I was a teenager. I don't remember exactly how old I was. I want to say maybe 13, 14, something like that. I don't remember. But I just couldn't get into them. I wasn't really, thinking back on it, I was never that much of a princessy kind of girl. It wasn't that necessarily I didn't like fairy tales, but I didn't grow up with fairy tales. Little tidbit about me. My parents, my mother specifically, did not allow me to read fairy tales until I was an adult. I read my first book of fairy tales when I was 20. And they weren't the Disney tales either. Because Disney, don't get me on the soapbox. I'm not getting on that soapbox. But pretty much anybody I met back then enjoyed the Princess Diaries. And it wasn't that I disliked the movies, but really the only reason I watched the movies was because Julie Andrews was in it, and I like Julie Andrews. Who doesn't? But that was the only reason I bothered. So, I mean, I'm sure other people still really like them, and I'm sure the books still have a lot of sentimental value for people who were around the same age as me, around the same time. And that's fine. It's just that I was never really into, now that I think about it, young adult fiction. Even when I was a young adult, even when I was a teenager, I wasn't into the teenage genre, which is interesting. A popular book or series everyone hates but you love? I don't know. What is popular these days? What is it that people hate these days? I'm not sure. Well, hate's a really strong word. I wouldn't say I don't know. I don't really keep up with what's popular. I just tend to notice what I find interesting, and sometimes I'll read something just for the sake of going into a different genre, or a nonfiction book on a topic that I know nothing about and may not have all that much of an interest in, but I'll read it just for the sake of reading it, because I think your reading muscle needs to be exercised in more than one way. So I'm not exactly sure I have an answer to this question. Popular book or series everyone hates but you love. I don't know. I mean, I can think of trendy things that people are obsessed with or have been obsessed with in the past that I'm like, yeah, whatever. Okay. You find it interesting, fine. I don't get it. I don't really have an interest in it, and sometimes that's just because at the time that everybody else is interested in a particular series or genre, I have a tendency to be involved in something completely different. So I'm not sure that's really an answer, but a love triangle where the main character ended up with the person you did not want them to, or a one true pair you don't like. This is going to be another one of those where I'm not sure I have a good answer, because I don't generally read books that have love triangles in them. I'm not big on the romance genre, period. I will say, though, in Louise Penny's Three Pine novels, and this is not going to have spoilers, I'm trying to keep everything as spoiler free as I possibly can. There is one book in Louise Penny's Three Pines series, or Amalgamage series, in which something is discovered about one of the characters, one of the long-standing characters who lives in Three Pines. And it has to do with his relationship to another family member. I found that to be very interesting because it put, in that particular story, it put that long-standing member of the community within the circle of suspicion, at least to a certain extent, because I'm trying not to give away too much, because if it was information that even people who had known this character for an extended period of time was not privy to. And I found that interesting because it was a plot twist that I really wasn't expecting. And I think I kind of hoped that it would lead in a direction that it didn't. Or that, well, not necessarily that it would lead in a direction that it didn't, but I was kind of hoping that it would be something that would be explored more in depth later. I was hoping that one of the subsequent books would revisit that a little bit and perhaps even, I don't know, maybe spin that off in some way, incorporate that into something. I'm not sure how to explain it without giving away too many of the details, but I'm still reading the series, of course, and I'm not exactly disappointed with the way that Louise Penny handled that. I think in the long term, I think she handled it the way that the story needed it to be handled, and that was the important thing. But I'm not sure that perhaps at some point she'll do something else, either with that character or with someone else in Three Pines or connected to Three Pines. I'm sure she will, because she's still writing the stories. But that was sort of kind of a disappointment, not for that book necessarily, but for the books that came after that, the first and second book that came after that. Because I guess I was interpreting it as, oh, she's going to set up a new conflict that's somehow going to get worked into another mystery. But I think I was jumping to conclusions. That was me jumping to conclusions. I think that's really what that was. Okay, so this question is easy. Popular genre you hardly reach for. Romance. Romance, number 1. Horror, number 2. I was going to say true crime, but that's not, now that I think about it, that's not really true, because I do like reading The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, which I'm not sure you would really categorize that necessarily as true crime. It is a biography, and it is about a suspicious death and questions that have lingered around the death of Dorothy Kilgallen. But I also have a copy of Mindhunter by John Douglas. I haven't completely read that book yet. I have read all of The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, but I haven't read Mindhunter yet. So to a certain extent, yeah, I do reach for true crime, but not nearly as much as fiction mystery. So popular genre you hardly ever reach for. Okay, true cross off true crime. I have started reading a certain amount of true crime. So romance, horror. I don't really read sci-fi. To me, sci-fi is something you watch. I grew up with Next Generation and the original Star Trek, so that's probably why. Fantasy. I don't read fantasy. At least not, yeah, I don't read fantasy at all. I don't find it interesting, which is probably going to surprise some people who know me a little better, that I wouldn't reach for fantasy, but I don't know, I don't find it interesting. I think over time I get a little bored with fantasy, which is probably also one of the issues I have with romance. I don't know. It's not that I don't like it when people include romance in a story. It's just that sometimes I think people include love interests for characters because they think that's what they're supposed to do, when really the story would be perfectly fine without them. A popular or beloved character you can't seem to get into. Well, I don't really know who that would be, because I don't really keep up with reading trends. Welcome to the BookTube channel, where the person who's interested in doing BookTube does not keep up with book trends. Like, I just talk about what I enjoy reading. Like I said, I couldn't really get into most teenage book characters. I couldn't really get into young adult fiction. I did because I'm sure people are going to ask, didn't you read The Twilight Saga by Stephanie Meyer? Yes, I did. I own first edition copies of all 4 books. But even then, I wasn't really a fan or a twihard, as they used to be called. I watched all the movies when they came out. I complained about all the movies when they came out. The books held my interest a lot more than the films, actually. The films were more of a spectacle to me. And I watched them more out of curiosity to see how the books were going to be interpreted and to see the visual interpretation of the characters that Stephanie Meyer had created. But I was never really all that into the characters. I wasn't really all that invested in the characters. And in retrospect, I think, because I was also writing back then, of course, I think I have a tendency to read like I'm a writer, and to a certain extent also write like I'm a reader. I don't know. I don't think I'm that. I may not be as successful at that as I probably should be, but hey, everybody's a work in progress. So I can't really say that there's a popular character that I can't get into, unless I cheat and say practically every popular character. Though I do enjoy, I can get into all of the characters in the Chronicles of Narnia. So those are popular characters that I do find interesting. But more contemporary characters, not really. No, not really. Now, of course, that may change at some point because I'm always reading new things, but I don't become extremely emotionally involved or emotionally attached or emotionally invested in most of the characters that I've read. I tend to, and that's not to say that I don't want things to turn out well for them, I do, but I tend to look at it more like this character has to endure what they're enduring in order to become who they're ultimately supposed to be. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I don't get overly involved in characters, whether they're popular or not.
Hey folks, future me cutting in here. I was just in the process of editing this video and I realized that I accidentally skipped over question 6 in the tag. So I'm going to put the usual written question on the screen as I was doing for the previously recorded questions, and then I'll come back and answer it and just edit this into the footage that I already have.
So question 6 is a popular author you can't seem to get into. Like I said before, I'm not that interested in the fantasy genre. I'm not particularly interested in crime fiction. I have heard of James Patterson's work, but I haven't read anything that he's written. My mother actually came across a secondhand copy of one of his books and decided to get it. I think she was actually gifted it by somebody who was paring down their library and needed to make some room. I don't know if she's read it yet or not, but I know I haven't. I might at some point, but I tend to not gravitate towards authors just because they're popular. I'm not familiar with any popular authors really in fantasy per se. I'm not familiar with which authors are popular in the nonfiction genre. I tend to go more for either the cozy mysteries or traditional mystery. Let's see, what else? I have read some historical fiction. I've even read some mysteries that are set in a historical setting. That was primarily inspired, that interest was primarily inspired by the fact that I came across the film adaptations of the Brother Cadfael novels, which I intend to get at some point. I haven't read any of the Brother Cadfael novels, but I have seen the film adaptations. So I think I'm going to read the original source material for that. And I do like those stories. At least the adapted versions, so we'll see what I think about the original versions. So apart from fantasy, crime fiction, yeah, I don't really know who most of the popular authors in those genres are. I mean, apart from James Patterson, I don't think that I've ever read a Stephen King novel. I've had the opportunity to, but I just wasn't interested because I'm not interested that much in the horror genre. So I have seen a couple of different adaptations of Stephen King's work, but even with films, I don't really go for the horror genre. It's nothing against anybody's writing style. I'm just not interested in the genre. So those are the questions for, well, those are the answers for question 6. And now back to the original footage. Popular book trope you're tired of seeing. And some of the examples that they give are lost princess, corrupt leader, love triangle, etc. Well, like I say, I don't really read books with love triangles in them. It's not that I avoid them. It's not that I avoid them. It's just that somehow or other the books that I end up reading just don't have that. Unless one corner of the triangle gets murdered, maybe, then yeah, yeah, I might read it then. I might read it then. Probably would read it then. Particularly if it's an Agatha Christie, I would more than likely read it then. But popular tropes. What is a popular trope currently? I'm not sure. But I will say one of the bones that I have to pick, not with any specific writer, not with any specific book, not with any specific series, but this is partly based on my own experience and partly based on things that I have heard over the past, must have been 4 or 5 years. That, and as well as comments that have been written by writers as well as people who are attached in some way to the publishing industry. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is the Unpopular Opinions Tag, so it's just my opinion. I'm not saying that if you're a writer you shouldn't be doing this. I'm not saying if you're a reader you shouldn't be reading these types of books. Write whatever you want, read whatever you want. It's perfectly fine with me. I'm simply giving my opinion. One of the things that I noticed is that there has been what I like to call a push to merge, or an urge to merge, as Nick Charles once put it. to insert various ideas that are trendy and popular at the time of the book's, either the time of the book's writing or possibly still at the time of the book's publication, that don't necessarily move the story along. There is, and at first I thought, well, maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just that for whatever reason, I'm noticing these particular plot twists or character creations or character insertions. Good example of this that I started to find, I thought it was nice at first, but it started making me feel a little odd, was the near constant insertion of at least one either homosexual, bisexual, trans, whatever character into practically every single book that came out. Which, if you're actually writing for that demographic, that's fine. If you enjoy reading literature that's geared towards those folks, fine. But am I really supposed to expect, or not expect, believe that virtually, and this is going to be a slight exaggeration, virtually every single author on the planet is supposed to be inserting characters with the so-called, quote, alternative lifestyle, unquote, and that this is now something that has to be inserted into practically every book that we read, because then it's one thing to do it if it actually furthers the plot. Case in point, Oliver and Gabby in Three Pines, Louise Penny. It's one of my favorite series, so that's why I'm bringing it up. They are a gay couple who live in Three Pines. They run a bistro and a B&B. Their placement in the story, every single character that Louise Penny writes is in the story for a reason, and the reason is not to gain the attention of a certain demographic. Because if she had just started throwing in all these random characters, like this guy is gay, this woman is black, this woman is divorced, this woman is a single mother, this guy has an issue with drugs, whatever. If she had just started peppering her story with all these different characters and not woven them together in a cohesive way, not make them real, genuine, living, breathing, three-dimensional characters who move the plot along, and nobody is trying to grandstand upstage anybody else, if she hadn't done it in the way that she did it, then the story wouldn't have made sense. It simply would have been a laundry list of people who are marginalized, which would have had the opposite effect. It would have, instead of bringing attention, so-called, if you're going to turn your writing career into activism, which personally I don't really think is a good excuse me, good idea. I'm fighting a sore throat. I'm trying to fight off a sore throat. If I don't really like the idea of turning a literary career into activism, because activism only survives for so long. and times change, progress is made. If you're going to, let's use the example of Oliver and Gabby. Had they not been fully three-dimensional characters, had they not actually had have a purpose to serve in the plot, and they're long-running characters too, their insertion would not have made any sense and would actually have become a turnoff, because it almost gives the impression, if you're reading a book like that, where the insertion of a certain type of character, or even the insertion of a particular plot twist, because we talk about this with plot twists all the time, so why wouldn't it apply to characters? Speaking as a writer and speaking as somebody who reads as a writer, I can tell you it does. It does. It makes a difference. Plot twist, character doesn't matter. It has to be there to serve a purpose, and the purpose has to make sense. If it doesn't, then it takes you out of the book, and it almost makes you feel, especially if you're inserting fill in the blank, gay character, Native American character, whatever, for no real reason, then it kind of gives you the impression that the author or authoress is simply trying to get noticed by that demographic, or the author or authoress is there to make a point as opposed to tell a story. Because if it's a good story, it's not going to matter really if the characters are like you. I don't necessarily want all the characters in a book to be like me. In fact, I don't really know anybody personally who wants to see themselves in every single character in every single book all the time. I would rather read about people who are different enough from me that I can learn, but still similar enough to me and have enough of a purpose in the story to hold my interest. Because otherwise it just feels like you're being preached to. And it feels, this will probably be unpopular, like that demographic is being merged, for lack of a better way of putting it. Which is part of what I mean by it makes it look like the author, or maybe even the publisher, because I have heard it said, I don't know if it's true, but I have heard it said over the past 4 or 5 years that there have been publishers or people connected to the publishing industry who have pushed authors to insert characters or create plot twists that were geared more towards current events, whatever those current events were, or else they wouldn't publish the book or wouldn't give as much support. Or that, and again, I don't know if that's true, but I have come across people online mostly who have made complaints about it. Not readers necessarily, but people who are attached in some way to the publishing industry. And another thing you have to keep in mind is that it takes a while to write a book, and what's going to be trendy and popular when you start writing, or even when you finish writing, is not necessarily going to be trendy or popular when the book is published, let alone 10 years down the road. even 5 years down the road. It's not necessarily going to be trendy. So if you're going to insert something that is more easily dated, it has to have a point. You know, there's a reason why, or multiple reasons why we tend to like stories set in, let's say, World War II. There are reasons why we like the classics, because even though that way of life, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the story, is gone now, for us, the stories are crafted in a way that everything has a purpose, everything makes sense, everything is evenly balanced, and nobody is trying to upstage anybody else. Nobody's trying to get the attention of a particular group. Nobody's trying to make a certain point, even though I'm sure in retrospect there will be people who will say that, well, so-and-so was trying to make a point that was very much needed at the time in their writing, and that may be true, it may not be true, because that's reader's interpretation. That's your interpretation as a reader. You don't really know what was going on with the author at the time that they were writing it. And even if what the author ended up writing about was readily interpreted as an opinion or a comment being made on something that was happening at the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where it came from. Speaking from personal experience, doesn't necessarily mean that's where it came from. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's a combination of both, because writers have a tendency to just take one piece and weave it with 50 different other pieces. And then the reader comes along and says, oh, I resonate with this in this way, so it must mean this. Not necessarily, not necessarily. And that's okay. I mean, we're supposed to find our own meanings in people's writings, I think. I think that's good. I think whatever you want to read, go for it. But for me, I feel like it would be unjust of me, for me, speaking just for myself, it would be unjust if I inserted a concept or a character purely based on the fact that it's getting noticed at the moment and doesn't really have any purpose to the story. And not every plot twist and not every character change is necessary to tell a good story. Sometimes less is actually more. Sometimes it really is. And sometimes readers don't really want to see the fictional equivalent of something that is going on in the physical world around them. A lot of people read to escape. Some read to learn, but most of us also read to escape. It's not one or the other, it's both. So that's just my opinion. It may be unpopular, that's okay, you're entitled to yours. I'm just speaking as both a reader and a writer and someone who has noticed certain changes that, just based on the sheer number of times it's being done, seems to imply that certain things are, if not deliberately pushed, at least definitely encouraged. And I think some of it is probably well-intentioned, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good story or good for the story, because if there's an entertaining story about somebody who's radically different from me, a fictional character who's radically different from me, and I find that story interesting, I'm going to read it. It doesn't matter if it's a popular idea or not. If I find an interesting story about somebody who is more like me, then I'm going to read it. You know, I don't particularly care if I see myself in a character or not. Actually, I prefer not to. I don't necessarily want to see somebody I know in a character either, because sometimes that takes you out of the story. Popular book series you have no interest in reading. That's pretty easy, and I think there are probably a couple of people who watch my videos who will already know what I'm going to answer. Game of Thrones. What the heck? I mean, frankly, I don't know anything about the TV show, don't really want to know anything about the TV show, but I think perhaps one of the reasons why I'm not all that interested in the books is because we hear so much about them. What's the term? Overhype or overhyped, whatever. Over advertised, oversaturated. I know it's supposed to get you all excited and make you want to read the books or watch the show or whatever. But for me, it has the opposite effect. I don't really have an interest in fantasy, period, as I've mentioned before. So that's another thing that it doesn't have going for it. I don't know what other popular fantasy or popular series in general or popular books have come out recently. Actually, I have a certain, not aversion, but I do have a bone to pick with certain classics. I don't really have, or at least I didn't previously, have very much of an interest in reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But I think that, once again, it was because Hollywood ruined it for me. Because the film adaptation, most famously the Boris Karloff adaptation, they went in a distinctly different direction with that as opposed to what Mary Shelley actually wrote. So I have decided that I will read Frankenstein, but mostly because of what I have heard from people who have analyzed the novel. And I'm not going to give away my thoughts on it here and now. I'll do a separate book talk video on that, which should be, I think that's going to be a lot more interesting than any of the ones that I've done previously, because there's been so many adaptations of that book, and I have some thoughts on it already. So now that I've given a little dissertation on that, and since now the light is starting to go, I turn the blinds a little bit more. Let's see if I can get a few more minutes. Last question. The saying is, the book is always better than the movie, but what movie or TV show adaptation do you prefer more than the book? I'm going to try to be brief. I'm going to try to be brief. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Dresden Files. I saw the TV show first. I'm not exactly sure. I think I got this from the library originally, but this is the film adaptation. It's called The Dresden Files. They only did one season. I got issues with the fact that they only did one season of this because this show is actually really good. I don't agree with everything in it, but the stories are actually really, really good. This was made in 2007. Paul Blackthorne plays Harry Dresden. I'll just read the back copy for it. It's based on Jim Butcher's best-selling novels, The Dresden Files, chronicles the cases of no ordinary detective. Harry Dresden is a wizard, the only one listed in the Chicago phone book, so it's set in the real world. He's got a handle on the crimes that can't be solved by anyone else. Paranormal? No problem. Dresden deals in all matters of supernatural threats. If you need a little hocus pocus or some otherworldly advice, Dresden's your man. And this is actually a really entertaining show if you're able to. I don't know if you'd be able to watch it for free on YouTube or not. You might be able to find it on Amazon Prime. Check your local library and see if they have this, or ILL loan. But I attempted, because they ended up canceling the show after only one season. I have a bone to pick. I have a bone to pick. They do this with every single show that I like. Every single one. They end up canceling. They either cancel it or they finish it way too soon. So I decided, out of desperation, to see if I could get the original books that the show is based on. And I did come across them in my local library. How do I put this? How do I put this? It's not that I didn't like how Jim, I'm not sure if it's pronounced, I think it's pronounced Butcher. It's not that I don't like how Jim Butcher writes. It's not that I don't like his writing style. I just didn't much like the stories. I didn't much like the stories. I liked Dresden, but I didn't like the stories. The stories were very confusing to me, and you could say, well, it's because you came to it after having watched the show. But I didn't come to the books believing that they were going to be identical to the show. I came to the books wanting to read the source material, so my attitude was not one of comparison or contrast. I wasn't expecting every single character to be exactly as they're portrayed in the film. For instance, May, the character May, and I forget this guy's name. Her personality in the book ended up being, their personalities ended up being switched for the show. So May, I'm pretty sure that's her name. I'm going to have to rewatch this. I haven't watched it in quite a while. Doesn't really like Dresden in the show. She doesn't really like him at all. She, in the book, was more even-tempered than she is in the show. But I mean, I could deal with all of that. It was the plot, as well as the character Bob in the show, who is, I'll show you, he's right here with the white hair. I prefer Bob in the show to Bob in the books. 100%. 100%. I was really expecting a show that was this interesting to be based on source material that wasn't identical to it, but definitely had the same feel. I couldn't really get the same feel from the books. Now, that's not to say that the books wouldn't appeal to somebody else, but for me, the show actually makes more sense. There are, I'm going to try not to spoil it, but Bob is a unique character, and I'm able to connect with him a whole lot more as that character in the show than I could in the books. To give you an idea of how difficult it was for me to really become engaged in the books. It's becoming really dark in here. I decided to just read the books in the library and not check them out. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the books are bad, like I say. I just didn't want to actually check them out. I have a tendency to only check out the books that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt I'm going to not just want to read, but actually want to really sit with for a while and contemplate. But I ended up just sitting with those books in the library and not actually checking them out. So, out of curiosity, a while back I decided to see if anybody else had not the same problem, because the man can write whatever he wants, and I didn't appreciate the crudity that was worked into Bob's character, which in the books you don't get that in the show. But hey, different tastes for different people. But I decided to see if anybody else had a similar experience, not necessarily the same, but a similar experience to me. And sure enough, there were a few people who said that they, to a certain extent, prefer the show as well. That even though the show in some cases drastically deviates from the books, they don't really have an issue with it, and in some ways they actually prefer it. My understanding is that the reason why the show was canceled was because of one of the writers' strikes that was going on at the time, and this is one of the shows that was axed. And we're left wondering what's going to happen. Who knows, I might actually do a review of the show as well at some point. This is primarily a channel about books, but I think if the time ever comes when I end up doing maybe some longer videos focused more on writing, character development, things like that, I might do a little bit of a comparison and contrast and use this and probably a couple of other things that I have to illustrate some points. But if you'd like to know anything else about any of the books or the series, the shows that I've mentioned in this tag, because we've come to the end of the tag now, feel free to drop a comment down below. The light just barely held out, so I think I better cut this off now. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, that you go out and try to not just, what's the phrase? Spread a few smiles, decide to bury the hatchet if necessary, preferably not in somebody's back, please, and just forget about issues and apparent problems that are really trying to divide people, because in the end, that's not gonna really matter as much as you think it is. So I hope you try to come together a little bit more and read books, read books, read books. Bye.